too chaotic for us today, seeing that we're back doing something in person in a room that I don't think we've used for this before. I've used it for other things, so I'm not panicking because I'm in a completely foreign environment. And Steve's happy because he knew how to work the AV system in the room. Yeah, but we got there.
I'm not using the webcam microphone at all.
Okay, so welcome everyone to this month's meetup. As per usual, I'm still Mark.
I'm still Steve.
We're in
Still Ben.
I can touch Mark. So for those of you who aren't aware of where we are, so in the city, like above one of the many entrances to Wynyard Station, there's a Microsoft reactor. So if you kind of need to know exactly where it is, if you know where that old wooden
Starbucks.
There's a lot of Starbucks around as well.
Don't say Starbucks.
Not as many, but there's the for those of you who grew up in Sydney and knew the old wooden elevator or escalator that kind of like consumed at least 3 lives per year. It's directly above where that has now been transferred or transformed into a work of performance art.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, it's hanging from the ceiling. It's a catching people.
Yeah. Well, let's be honest, it's probably going to fall down eventually.
Yeah.
Kill somebody again.
Yeah, it's just biding its time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so for today's topic, we just thought we'd keep it fairly focused again, especially today because we weren't particularly sure what the room facilities, etc., would be like. So we didn't really want to do anything terribly exciting today and introduce things that would have you walk away going, wow, I've never seen anything like it. Instead, we thought we'd use today's topics really around getting some ideas from people around the pitfalls, the pros, the cons of different things you can do from either a work lab environment or more particularly if you're working from home more these days. Just some of the things you might need to take into account when you are building out a home, your home lab environment, and things that like common mistakes that people make, things that people learn along the way. And one of the first slides I've got in this is basically saying that something that's probably going to be hold true for a lot of it, which is that a lot of it is just based on people's experience. So there are some people who will swear by this is the only way you should ever consider doing this kind of thing. Well, that's kind of wrong to begin with because there would be multiple ways. Otherwise, they wouldn't have to tell you there's only one way. So personal preference is going to be a big part of it, but also because we're focusing a bit more on building, trying to build out some kind of environment if you're still working from home a lot. That's got really different considerations to when you're working in an office and potentially got space where you can put things, even getting questions as to why does this, what is this? Why does it look so ugly? Why does it make so much noise? It looks like this other thing. Why do we have 2 of them? So there's a lot of those types of considerations.
You need another laptop.
Yeah. So there's no shortage of approaches that you can take here. So we'll talk about the pros and cons, but at the end of the day, it's probably not going to change your opinion too much. But there might be a few things that that do sort of catch you a little bit by surprise with that. So I guess first up, we do have quite a few people in attendance. We've got a couple of people in the city, so it's not just Steve and I. I won't tempt fate and turn the camera around so that you can see them because we've got things working. We don't want anything going wrong.
Considering I've already taken down and restarted the team from doing that.
Yeah, so we're not going to do that. So I guess just then, if there's anyone who's new who either wants to unmute to do an intro, or if either of you just want to give a bit of,
feel free to come up and stand on camera if you want as well.
This is also very exciting for everyone that's remoted in because it's like I'm at a user group in the early 90s and we're running through some kind of like Game Boy camera. It's very good. It's all high quality.
Yeah. How did you know it was a Game Boy camera?
Listen, I have my ways.
Okay, so anyone, any takers?
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm yet another Steve. I'm sure there's many of us here.
Yes.
And I'm from an MSP.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Hello everyone, my name is Henry. I just recently joined Microsoft GPS team as a cloud solution architect. So I mainly focus on endpoint security and endpoint management. Nice to meet you all.
Yeah. Oh, fantastic. Thanks for coming along. So did Phil Mayer send you along?
Not exactly, but
Yeah, close. So I'm on the right track.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. He gently encouraged you to come along. Yeah. Is Phil online?
I don't think he
I
is.
saw that he registered, but
No, it's not joined yet.
okay, that means we can't call Phil out.
I mean, you can.
And he just can't respond.
He can come back on the video.
Okay. So just a couple of quick intros that we've had here. So let's just jump straight in and talk about just some of the, I guess, top things you should keep in mind when it goes through and building out, whether you want to call it your lab environment, etc. So let's just start off with what I said. So basically, this is the warning saying that you don't have to agree with everything we're about to say. You can dispute quite a bit of what we're about to say, but it's going to all be based on our personal opinions. Now, as we go through it, you'll see that I've tried to be as fair and balanced as possible, but that just means that I'm being less biased in certain areas than I normally would be. It doesn't mean that I'm being unbiased in these areas. So once again, with these, for the different scenarios we go through, I'm sure most of you have probably had some exposure to some of these. So please either jump into chat or we can hear you. We hear you through the in-room audio if you do want to unmute and say anything. So don't worry, we will be able to see the chat and hear you if you do unmute yourself. So as far as that is concerned, the room setup is actually pretty good for that. Now, I guess what I also should do, and I think Steve might have done this before we started recording, but you may have noticed that Patch My PC have kindly sponsored this month's event. So for those of us who are here in person, we actually get some special Patch My PC flavored pizzas.
Yep.
We're not
Delicious.
allowed to reveal the exact flavors that they are.
Vegetarian and vegan, apparently.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just jump in and talk about just some of the top line things before we even get into what should you look at getting. So the first one is work or home. Now, in a work environment, if you've got a proper lab, if you've got a room you can lock doors and not have to worry about
And
children.
by
and
lab,
pets.
we mean non-production environment.
Yes. Yeah.
Not a segment of your production environment that you can sit there and play in.
Like it might be in the same room.
Isn't everything production? Sorry, I just thought everything was production. If it's on, it's production, right?
Well, that's your production lab.
That's right.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And production, non-production.
Yes, nice.
So the work side of it, I think, is fairly easy, especially if you've also got work funding it. That tends to change a lot of the things that we'll talk about in here, but it doesn't necessarily eliminate them all. So first of all, is it going to be home use? Is it something you can use during daylight hours or at night when other people are around the house? And some of you are probably wondering what's he talking about. We'll cover some of that off. Now, other things as well that are important is, if it's like, you've got to think about the space constraints, where it's being set up. If you're kind of taking over, like, and running Ethernet, like across the room in the lounge room, and we're not just talking about a single cable, we're talking like basically spools of cable being run around a living area or a kitchen, the laundry. You are not going to be all that popular in that environment, and you might find that other people or animals may deliberately start kicking things out.
Yes.
And go, oops, I'm sorry. So
Never had that experience at all.
No. So, oh, did you need that plugged in?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was kind of
Oh.
sitting there.
It was making so much noise, I just thought I'd unplug it.
Yeah, I thought it was broken.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, so then other things that you need to think about is like obviously having a budget in mind. Now, regardless of what budget you have, you're going to spend a lot more
Yes.
than that budget over time. So think of it as your starting budget. But what it means though is that it means if you sort of pick a few good high quality components for what you're going to build around moving forward, it means that you don't have to go through the constant update cycle of going, oh, I wish I had a CPU that supported virtualization instead of going for that really low end cheap special that I saw. So yeah, so basically like have a budget in mind. And I think now we're starting to see most at least new component prices have started to settle down again.
Yep.
I think GPUs are the only thing that it's still
Good luck.
Yeah, and
They're getting better. They are
Yeah.
getting better.
but the good news is that GPUs don't really need to be a big part of this overall conversation.
Unless you're going to dual purpose it and have a gaming rig at
Yeah.
the same time.
Yes.
Don't tell your partner / work.
Yeah. Yes. Now so then some of the other things, and this is going to be based on, room, what room have you got available to you? What can you keep set up? Because you don't want to go overboard and find out that the time it takes you to pull everything out of a closet, get everything cabled up, try to troubleshoot everything. You don't want to turn you testing out a 5-minute scenario into a 30-minute testing and troubleshooting before you get to the scenario. So there's some, we'll talk about some of that stuff. Now, new or repurposed. Now, so the repurposed side, especially here, is like I'm guessing that most, if not all of you, work in IT in some form. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't be here.
We got to be a
means-
little bit forward.
Which means that you probably occasionally through your employer or through a customer that you're working with, you might be able to get your hands on either dirt cheap or free of charge
Borrowed
hardware. Yeah. Or no, like legitimate hardware in this case, where it's like, look, it's reached end of support, we want to move to something else. So yeah, so in this case, that could be something where it starts off as a great starting point. But like, especially if we're looking at, like if you're going to start spending money on that older hardware, you have to, if it's going, oh, this server with 16 gig is great, but if I upgrade it to 256 gig, it'll be even better. And it's like, what type of memory does it take?
Yeah.
How much is it going to cost?
What is the CPU
Yeah.
support? So if you've managed to score a cheap server, fantastic, great. But if the CPU doesn't support any of this new security principles, then you're putting a time box on how long you can support that platform.
Yeah, so and I think the first thing out of the gate that we'll talk about is servers like full size, or whether we're talking about, do people still buy pedestal servers, or is okay?
Yeah.
I just assume everything is rack mount these days, but
Oh,
people still, because that way you can put it under your desk.
that they can still do the S&P service.
So we'll talk about servers up next. Now, another thing that is basically pointless is someone saying, oh, I want to future-proof it. Because it doesn't matter how much money you throw at it. It's going to be kind of middle of the road equipment within a couple of years. Now,
Except that there's a lifespan of every device.
Yeah. And now that doesn't mean that it becomes, so think of it in terms of dollar value. Just assume that whatever you buy has got no resale value in the future. So it's a good, that way you're not going, oh, in 2 years' time I can sell it for X. So I think the only thing that has worked out well for is people who hoarded their old graphics cards over the last few years.
You know something? When I went and looked up my P51 to sell it or to rebuy it, it was still worth $3,000 after 4 years.
Wow.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
You jump on it at that.
Yeah.
Okay. So so on the future proofing side, it's like even little things there where like good ways of saving money is like don't go for the top end of whatever that CPU family is, because you might be lucky to get maybe 5 to 10% more performance. Cost is going to be 50 to 100% higher. So so there's a lot of places where you can just sort of make some sensible decisions, because the reality is the differences in CPU speed aren't that critical. It's going to be what the functionality is in a couple of years' time. Did you just happen to make the right the right choice here.
That
Now,
was more important.
yeah. Now, other things as well is don't buy equipment that you are not overly familiar with. Now,
What are you speaking about there, Mark?
now, in this case, let's go back to the server conversation. If you've never dealt with server OSs, sorry, the server OS itself probably isn't going to be the issue.
No.
It's jumping into a server, going through its firmware options and trying to make sense of, oh, I'm used to going into a desktop board and taking a look at these memory timings and all that kind of stuff. I look at the server and I don't see any of that. I see all of these other things that don't make any sense. So what you have to make a decision around here is, do you just want to get in and use this for the sake of labs? Are you just basically looking at the hardware going, this is just a means to an end? My role here is not to learn more about how to handle vendor X's hardware or and their support their support options, etc. Because that's a whole world until itself. So this is an area where you see people, like, especially again going back to that, work is selling off their old servers. Now, if you were managing those servers, you have probably got a particular one in mind because you know that it's spec'd up a lot more than any of the others.
Yep.
And they're just going to say, oh, look, each of them is X $100. You go, I'll take that one.
Yep.
No, that one, not the one next to it. So in a situation like that, if you know that vendor, even if you don't know that particular hardware, if you know that hardware vendor's platform, how they manage things, you're probably not a bad decision to go down that path. Now, is it important for your lab environment equipment to meet Windows 11 requirements? Probably not.
It depends on what you want
Yes.
to test.
Yeah,
And
it's your use case.
this is probably the big point, right? So if I'm wanting to test a device being provisioned with an operating system, so long as it can tick the box for the minimum requirements for Windows 11, fantastic. But if I'm wanting to be able to do things like Windows 5 for Business, biometric authentication, virtualization, well, yeah, then you're going to have that Windows 11 requirement. And that comes down to what do you want to test in the lab and what scenarios do you envisage? I think that's probably the best thing to look at is, right, what do you think is the most important?
Because if really the goal for you is just to test, different deployment options, and you don't care if you're deploying to a VM or a physical server, it's more that you want to test software deployment as opposed to driver compatibility or whatever. The Win 11 requirements are probably a good indication of what future versions of Windows Server is going to require.
Yes.
So there's generally a trend that CPU requirements or platform requirements on the client side, a generation or two later, tend to become requirements on the server side as well. And I think that applies especially more moving forward if we think about anything security related. So it doesn't have to meet Windows 11 requirements, but I would not go overboard on building something that doesn't meet it, or at least in concept. Or if I'm happy to stick with a current version of whatever virtualization platform or whatever I'm using for X amount of time, there's plenty of things we can, and we'll cover some of that stuff off in more detail, definitely. Now, the other one here is, does it need to be mobile? Now, if we went back a few years, the answer for a lot of us probably would have been more likely to be yes than it is today.
Yep.
So the laptop that I brought along, or the Surface that I brought that's sitting up here, the last time I used it was when I met you in North Sydney 2 months ago.
Yep.
And it's been sitting in my bag since then, so I wasn't too happy when I started it up in here. For some reason, it had a few things it needed to get sorted out. So going back a fair way, you didn't have a choice. If you wanted to have a lab environment where you could show people, like when you were out and about, you didn't have great options for remoting back into it, etc. So there might be cases where just sort of that mobile requirement means that you are looking at form factors like laptops, maybe Nooks, something along those lines. But if you don't have a mobile requirement, that you sort of end up getting a lot more for your money when you're not saying, I want this stuff crammed into a really, really small form factor. Because even when you sort of look at like your ThinkPad here, it's like even if you're saying, look, I'm never going to be using the screen on this, it's always going to be plugged into something external. Too bad, you've already paid for the screen. It's there.
The other thing that I'll call out here, and while yes, we're talking about a lab is typically one device, but depending on what you're wanting to test, that lab scenario may end up being 5 devices. Because you might need to have a mobile phone, you may need to have a MacBook, you may need to have all of these different devices. So it all comes down to what matches your requirements from a mobility point of view. For me personally, I only have one physical gaming computer in my house. All the rest are laptops. Everything is laptops. And that is just because that's how I want to roll. But I know Ben, his whole lab is all workstations and custom built computers. And he's got 2 laptops now.
I've got a couple of laptops, but they're primarily used as so the way that I've got things set up is almost diametrically opposite to the way that Steve's got things set up. Whereas I've got my lab self-exposed, like I can access anything that is sitting in my office from anywhere in the world within a relative range of security. So that I use my laptops as portable, essentially thin clients to get into my environment.
Yep. And that's exactly it. So it comes down to the requirements. Like for me, I like having that portability. I've got 2 15-inch laptops that are well spec'd out. I've got iPads, MacBook Airs, all of that stuff, so I can do the demos when I go to customer sites. I've got switches, I've got WAPs, I've got everything that I need. So when I go to conferences, I can go and present just on my lab. And I don't trust anybody else because I don't trust when I go to a conference that I'm going to have internet access to be able to go to Azure to get access to my lab.
Let's just put it out here, Steve. The reason that you don't trust that is because you've been burnt too many times.
Correct. Correct. It's quite entertaining when you go to conferences where they're like, we're going to have a separate internet connection for the presenters. It's like, yep, cool. So it's a separate SSID, but all the network infrastructure is on the same wireless access points.
But it's different.
So it's not the constraint at the internet pipe, it's the constraint at the access point, guys, and performance is going to be poor. So yeah, I've been burnt far too many times. So I'm all about one box. I have my hydration solution that we'll talk at the end of the session where I can provision a brand new environment, domain controller, CA, everything associated that I need to demo Config Manager. Not that I do it anymore. In about 2 hours, I can have a brand new environment ready to go.
Another important part of not relying on networks where you go.
Yes.
You might end up in a situation where you might have multiple VMs with public-facing network adapters, and it's random whether it's your laptop or one of the VMs that gets the IP address from the hotel or the venue network. So when people say, why do you always carry all this extra stuff? Like we're kind of joking before this session, and I was going, oh, look, do we need an Ethernet cable? I've got an Ethernet cable. These are things that, like, years of doing this stuff, you always think you're ready for everything. You aren't. You get close. So even you get to the point where you're going, okay, I've even got like my own 5G access point or whatever, and it's like, oh, damn it, we're in a room. The room that we're in is a dungeon, like 20 levels below sea level, and we've got no signal. So it doesn't matter. Yeah, you can try to plan for as many options as possible.
Or on the other side of that whole, I've got my own LTE connection. So does everybody else in the room.
Yeah.
And conference center. And they're just taking down the whole mobile network.
Yeah.
Or more importantly, you're at a conference center that is a giant Faraday cage and no one's got signal.
Yes. So then everybody's on the Wi-Fi, which
Yes.
So suffice to say, yes, there are certain scenarios where mobile with everything on the device makes sense, and there's other scenarios where having everything in your rack at home makes sense. We're not trying to tell you the right way to do it. We're just trying to give you the guidance and advice of what we've done.
For sure. Yeah, I for one can 100% put my hand up and say, if you are presenting at any kind of conference or even just showcasing virtual machines on a single laptop, if you don't show up with a USB Ethernet adapter, you're going to be in a world of pain.
Or your laptop doesn't have the Ethernet plug in there.
Yes, correct.
Okay, so I've bundled in two things together for this first one. So I've bundled in servers and workstations for a couple of reasons where they overlap. Now, in terms of, is one of them more home friendly than the other? Yes, workstations are definitely more home friendly, but
Because they don't take off.
yeah. So really here, if we, actually I should have put cons first here.
Yes.
And I should have had noise in capital letters and blinking
Yes.
at you. Because if somebody hasn't worked with server before, you will see, you'll go onto eBay and you'll see these like dual 20 core Xeon systems and go, like, it's only $300.
Yep.
Yeah.
There's a
And you get
reason.
really excited about it. And then it gets delivered and you turn it on and it's like, oh, why are my neighbors knocking at the door? Why are the dogs 6 floors down howling?
Or the best one is, I need to restart it. But it's 2 a.m. in the morning. Wife's asleep. I can't restart it because it's going to turn on all the fans.
Yeah.
But I need to restart it because I need to get this working for tomorrow morning.
And so let's continue on down the restart path. So yes, it will be noisy when you restart it,
Yes.
but it will also take about 15 minutes
Correct.
Mhm.
to restart.
Because it has to
Yeah.
check all the memory.
And
Yeah, I
that's
was about to
where-
say ECC memory.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
So that's where basically we start getting some of the overlap between workstation chipsets and server chipsets, and their startup times is not what you are used to. Like if you're used to a laptop that you hit the power button and 3 seconds later you're at the login screen, you are not going to enjoy working with servers if you haven't done it previously. Now, the good news there though is that if it's something that you like, but obviously this is, you can say this might be environmentally unfriendly, but if you can leave it running all the time, servers and workstations are fantastic for that stuff. But if it's something where you have to shut it down when you finish with it, and then go back and turn it on again when you're ready to start working with it again, like that's not, oh, give it 5 minutes and I'm in. That's, I will wait for as long as it takes for it to go through. And so things like the pros of memory expansion.
Yeah.
So it's like, oh, look, I can jam. And I'm speaking from first-hand experience with this one. It's like, look at this, look at how much memory I've got. So do you know how rarely I shut this down?
So you missed one on the list there, Mark,
What?
under the cons.
Oh, no, I thought we'd just start with noise.
No,
Yeah.
but there's actually additional that we missed on the list because it's associated with noise and the power on and the power. It's going to increase your cost on your power bill. Running a server at home costs you a lot of money.
And
Yep.
do you have air conditioning?
Yes.
Or no? So this is especially true if you, like, let's say, like we talk about those great deal servers, whether it's through your employer, a customer, or eBay. The other thing you have to think of here is that if you're getting something that the CPUs are a couple of generations old, that also means they're going to be running much more than today's CPUs. So basically you just have to be a little bit more wary of them. Now, there are lots of pros to servers. So assuming that you're not going back too many generations and finding that it's like, oh, it's like PCI 1x1 max throughput or something along those lines. So memory expansion is going to be a fantastic option. The number of PCI slots, the number of lanes you get. Now, if you sort of had to draw the line somewhere, even if we sort of think about Windows 11 requirements, basically figure out what are the Xeon or Threadripper, etc. type equivalents of the Windows 11 supported CPUs. So what are all of the post-meltdown and post-Spectre CPU releases that Windows 11 supports, as opposed to the pre-Spectre and meltdown CPUs that Windows 11 does not support? So at least that way you know that you're kind of in the right ballpark for the minimum of what, if you do end up wanting to run Win 11 on it, at least you know that it's not something where you're going to have to fudge together the. So Ben is flying the cat today. Yeah, so yeah, no cat for me today. No magical tails floating in the air.
He was trying as much as he could.
So yeah, so basically here, if we're talking about something fairly recent, I wouldn't be too fussed overall here about Gen 3 versus Gen 4 PCIe. There might be some edge case scenarios where if you're talking GPU related issues, then okay, different conversation. But if we keep GPUs out, even if we're talking about storage, are you going to notice the difference between Gen 4 NVMe drive versus a Gen 3 NVMe drive? If you sat there with a stopwatch, you go, oh, it was 0.006% of a second faster. And that's where you can also sort of look at sort of making some smarter investments as opposed. Investment's not the right word. It's a cost. Let's admit it. Also, internal drive base. We'll talk about the opposite of having a lot of internal drive base soon. But having a lot of internal drive base, even if it means you're buying weird looking mounting adapters to fit in drive types that aren't what the chassis was built for, it's still internal.
Fine. Or just dangling them in there with duct tape. Or
Don't listen to Steve.
Rubber, elastic bands.
Yeah, just insulated.
Yeah.
No.
Elastic bands absorb the vibration of hard drives.
Exactly.
Okay, so other things, the power on time. Now, other things that people may not also realize is if you see a server, like let's say you see like a rack mount server, someone will just sort of look at it and look at the height and go, oh yeah, I've got somewhere at home I can sit it. They don't realize that once you stand it up, it's almost as tall as you are. So they're like, oh, I didn't think it would be that deep. No wonder the shipping costs were so prohibitive.
And everyone, like, if you're working in a server room, all the dimensions are out of proportion because you don't actually realize that they're long and noisy because everything else in the room is long and noisy.
Yeah.
And then other things as well you got to think about with servers is if you are planning on hooking it up to a display, it's going to be VGA, or you're going to have to jerry rig some kind of whatever you support to VGA or USB VGA.
Or you put in a GPU.
We're trying to avoid that would be the other option is we use one of those PCIe slots to put a GPU in there.
If you're going to go and spend a considerable amount of money on a server or workstation, I'm sure you can spring for a GPU and turn it into a pseudo gaming computer.
So then other things here is that like just because it's supposed to be rack mounted doesn't mean it has to be rack mounted. But that's great if you've got one piece of gear. If you decide you want multiples, then just go somewhere, get a half height rack, get something, or basically build it out of something that looks like a Meccano set.
Ikea used to have coffee tables that were exactly the width of server racks, like standard server racks, that you could essentially buy for less than $100, and they were essentially 4U mini racks. I'm pretty sure they still sell them, and I'm pretty sure that the dimensions were designed with this in mind. You could screw like the rails onto the side of the thing with bolts, and it was perfect.
It's that ultimate space saving use case where you've got the coffee table in the middle of the room with the cables running to it.
Exactly.
So I'm sure
that's normal.
Yeah. And I'm sure spouses will be very happy about it. And you want.
I mean, it's Scandinavian design, Steve. It's perfect.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about microservice? So I don't think these seem to have had their time in the sun.
Yeah.
There was that period where it's like, oh, HP have got this. So first of all, it was that little blue home server one. Then they had the Gen 1 AMDs, and they moved across to Intel. Now I think they're back across to AMD. And these are actually quite nice if they fit your requirements.
Yes.
But if you start looking at them going, oh, if only they had this and this and this, they'd be perfect. That means they are not perfect for you.
Mhm.
So what do you end up seeing when it's not quite perfect? You end up seeing someone who had this idea, I just want everything consolidated into one box. And it ends up being one box plus 6 external drives and a whole bunch of other accessories plugged in where possible.
Yep.
So if you're already looking at, you're pretty much maxing it out before you go anywhere near it. Probably not the right option for you. Now, other things as well with these is that because of the power constraints they work under, because they want to keep it fairly low power, you'll find that the CPUs in them are generally okay, but not necessarily, the entry level ones, the CPUs are not great.
Yeah.
And you think, oh, how much extra to go with a model that's got more cores, more threads, and it's like, oh, it's double the price, and it's still only got 8 gig of memory.
But you'll also be looking at, like, a lot of these things will leverage laptop grade CPUs as well, which arguably is not a problem. No offense to Steve's amazing little portable server, but like if you're looking at building a micro environment for this sort of thing, then just get a laptop.
Yeah. Because if you're going micro, you may as well have a model.
Well, the question needs to be asked, like, why are you building a micro environment? Like, if is space a concern, then okay, look at what benefits you get with a laptop.
Because with a laptop, you can just close the lid and put it away.
Exactly.
So other things as well with a lot of the microserver designs, like they're pretty much built around like basically being turned into NAS type appliances. So it's like 3 drive bays or 3.5 inch drive bays. So basically still pretty flexible, but if that's not really what you're concerned about, it's a lot of space for storage options that you're not going to really be leveraging. And you're not going to have a whole bunch of extra onboard headers to plug in other things that you would prefer to have in there. Now, again, just sort of some of the final pieces on this one is that so these are still pretty portable as long as you don't have, basically, as long as it doesn't look like Medusa and have a bunch of cables hanging out of it. But because they are still server boards, you still have longer power on times with these. Now, sometimes the vendors are basically just using desktop chipsets and desktop CPUs, so that power on time may not be as much of an issue. But there's probably still going to be some extra storage logic, etc., in there that is going to probably double or triple, what you think the startup time is going to be.
Definitely.
Now, getting into even smaller form factor, and I'm sure there'll be quite a few people with some input on this one. So rather than just saying Nook, which is, not just Nook, but basically anything else that's like an Intel Nook, so something that's really small, jams a lot into it, but there are definitely pros. If someone wants something that's portable, you've got some options that have got some additional GPU capabilities in them, but again, it's building on top of laptop parts. So basically, it's laptop memory that's going in. It's a laptop CPU, but some of them have got some good options good for the size in terms of storage. So you might have like an NVMe slot or two. You might also have like a 2.5 inch drive bay for an SSD. So so these days, the number of how many storage slots or whatever type you've got isn't as big as a deal as it used to be, unless you're looking into some, let's call it media archiving. It's not the same story that it used to be, but there are quite a few downsides here. So first of all, if you want, if you start looking for options with more than a single built-in NIC, then it's going to really restrict the options that are available. You might turn around and say, well, couldn't I just plug in another USB NIC instead? And it's like, into your one port. Well, you've probably got 2 ports. You really want to start hanging USB hubs off, then other adapters. So again, going for something a little bit bigger is actually going to be cheaper and save you space in the long run. Now, other concerns to think about here is that some of these are kind of working within pretty tight thermal constraints. So like I've got one Nook at home that it just runs hot constantly. I'm shocked that it still runs, but yeah, you touch it, it's like, ouch, I won't do that again. Rather than fixing the issue, I just don't touch the top of it.
Exactly. You've just put don't touch.
Yeah.
In text
Oh,
because you could.
Oh, no, I still, yeah, I put the sticker on, but the sticker melted.
Yeah.
So yeah, so with some of these, just again, sort of thinking about what's the use case. If portability is important to you, if you're looking at the restrictions and going, look, if I really get any major restrictions, I'll just put another one on top of it. Like the amount of vertical disk space I've got is almost unlimited compared to the horizontal disk space. So so this can still be a pretty flexible option. And you still see that there are plenty of people who basically have like a bag full of these that are that's their traveling lab.
Yep.
And you see that it's like, it's not okay. Would I prefer everything to be one device? Yes, but some of the benefits that they have when they split things out like that is they've got redundancy.
Oh yeah.
Like they're basically saying, look, a VM for each of these things is on all 4 of the devices I'm carrying around. So worst case scenario, I ramp down the memory, restrict CPU usage for each one, and I could have 3 out of 4 fail, and I could still get something done.
Hello, clustering.
Yes. Now, let's just quickly, actually, something that's important here as we now sort of switching across from the server and workstation side down to more of the desktop side. The other thing to think about here, and this is something I've seen people do with NUCs that always makes me cringe to a degree. I understand why they do it, but it's like, this is going to cause a problem for you. Is if you can't get native server drivers for the server OSs you are running natively. If you're going through and hacking an Intel driver package to get the network working and to get video working, etc.
I've never done that ever.
No, there's like, it's not like Windows Update is ever going to stomp over that thing that it thinks it's got a better version of, because it does. It just doesn't realize that neither of them actually really work with the device that you've got. So this is something that like I've seen way too many times here, where someone's going, oh yeah, NICs just aren't performing the way that they used to, and it's like, oh, because you haven't jerry-rigged your own driver recently. Yeah, that's why. So just be careful with that, and it's not really as much of a problem as it used to be, but it can still be a little bit of an issue.
Yeah, especially certain vendors that have a fruit in their name, like to make it so they only have proprietary hardware for their equipment.
Orange?
Orange.
Orange. Okay. I just wanted to confirm. I've had nothing but problems with them.
Yeah, I don't know if it's still the case, but I know at one point you had to go and modify the drivers to get their network adapters to work, and on server OS, and you also had to do something for the storage controllers. Otherwise, it would run as IDE instead of SATA speeds.
Nice.
So I'm going to hand over to you.
Oh,
so I'm going to get a piece of pizza because you are the laptop man.
What are we talking about? Big laptops? Nobody has a big laptop. That's just silly. So look, I am of the party of, I have a ridiculously large workstation laptop. My current incarnation is an i9 with 128 gig of RAM and 4 terabytes of storage with a 6 gig graphics card, LTE. Other than the CPU, it's literally every other feature ticked to the top. Or I've gone and put aftermarket storage. Why do I do this? Because I like the portability, as I said at the top. The cons for that is when I travel, I literally with my laptop exceed most carry-on luggage requirement, maximum storage, like maximum kilos. Simple as that. So whenever they're like, yeah, we're going to weigh your bags, I'm like, all right, cool. Make sure you check luggage has gone through first, and then I'll put it on there, and they're like, that's really heavy. I'm like, yeah, that's laptops. Multiple. Oh, okay, cool. Do you have any other bags that you can split that into? Yeah, they're going over there. Sorry. So, and because it's electrical equipment, they can't actually tell you to put it into your checked luggage because you're not allowed to do that anymore.
Yep.
Yay, lithium-ion batteries.
Love fires.
Do you like hot glue your batteries in to make sure they can't get into it?
This one here, you can't actually remove the battery.
Perfect.
So sealed unit devices are fantastic because you can't remove the battery, so therefore you can't check it. Throw in, say, a digital SLR that's like, I'm not putting that in checked luggage because mirrors and stuff. And are you going to give me $6,000 if you break my camera? And it's like, no. So it's suffice to say, I normally have more weight in my carry-on luggage than my checked luggage, which is quite entertaining. But what that means is I have the portability to be able to go into sessions, go into conferences and just do what I need to do. I also have the flexibility. So for me personally, this laptop, I'm doing a demo tomorrow for internal training. I need to have access to physical network appliances. I need access to a whole heap of things. I'm running the whole thing off my laptop while also powering 4 screens to present it in different scenarios and different configurations. I'm running my streaming software being OBS, and my laptop isn't even having a heartbeat. It's fantastic. Mind you, it's quite concerning when you're sitting there and going, oh, my laptop's running slow. Why is my laptop running slow? Oh, I left my 4 VMs that I put 30 gig of RAM on because I just wanted them to boot quickly. And I'm using 95% of my memory. And it's like, why are you doing this? And it's like, so there is advantages for that, but then also on the downside, like, so as part of what we're doing with presentations, because this laptop is my primary laptop, I have to have virtual machines that I host out so I don't leak my confidential data, because otherwise it's going to share out what I've got on my desktop. So this is where having a separate lab computer is fantastic for a host, but also if you're going to run a laptop, you've just got to make sure that you have the ability to isolate what you're wanting to present out, because there are certain constraints that you need to take into consideration on that front. It's fun. But yeah, so me personally, I love it, but yeah, they are very heavy. The power bricks. This is the power brick for my laptop. It's huge.
Where were we that you forgot the power brick and you needed to buy one? Singapore.
So I got all the way to Singapore. This was with my old laptop, so it was a P51. It was fantastic. Xeon 64 gig. It doesn't charge off USB-C. Even though it has a USB-C port, it requires 150 watts minimum to start charging. The maximum you can put out of a USB-C charger is 100 to 120. So it doesn't charge my laptops. The question in the chat from Anthony is, how long does the battery last without charging?
I responded in chat.
So I had this laptop sitting on my kitchen table this morning while I was going through my emails. I had some VMs running in the background because I had my lab up and running to do stuff. I swear I was only at the kitchen table for about an hour, maybe maximum hour and a half, and I had 25% battery left. If you turn on the battery saver mode immediately as soon as the laptop comes up, you can get to 6 hours.
Yeah.
And it doesn't actually impact the device performance all that much. On my old laptop, where I didn't have a touchscreen, it lasted a little bit longer, but this laptop I went high res, touchscreen. It's quite ridiculous, but it's fantastic. Does it do everything I need it to do? Yes. There are, but I'm going to put that asterisk there, right? There are scenarios where I need to have other physical devices. So I have 3 Surface Go's. I have, as I said, a couple of iPhones, a couple of Pixels, Android devices. And this is where my lab is not just one device, because I'm a desktop guy or end-use compute guy. I need to be able to go across multiple things. It is quite entertaining, yeah, going and traveling has been. I walk around with 2 mobile phones.
In case, just so that you can be contactable at any given time.
Yeah, exactly.
He's checking one of his many devices right now.
Yes, so I am indeed. But yeah, for that laptop, it's portable though, and that's the good thing, right? It's very portable and it gives me the scenario. So to answer Dean's question around, do you virtualize your iOS and Android devices? All right, so Android, yes, I have virtualized. I've done a video on it. It does sort of work, but there are some constraints around what you're doing with virtualization on Android. iOS, there is no virtualized iOS device available. Even on the Mac OS, when you're running it in their development toolset, I cannot remember the name of it for the life of me. It's still an emulator.
Yeah.
It may have changed with the M1 Max, but I don't have an M1 Max to test that.
If anything, Steve, I would suggest that it's gone backwards. So back when they were using Intel CPUs, the route to build a Hackintosh device was quite easy. Now that they're using their own baked-in silicon, I think it's actually gone back to being difficult.
Well, no. So when it was iOS, when you're wanting to replicate that, the reason why you couldn't is because it was running the M1 chips.
Sure, right.
So now that the M1 chip and all of that technology exists in the Macs, conceptually it could work, but I don't know if that's been released or made available.
Sure.
Mac OS, yes, you can virtualize Mac OS on Macs, and you can then present it out. So if you're going to do virtualization of Mac OS, that's where you need to have a Mac as your primary device to be officially supported and not run into any issues. Because refer back to drivers.
Yeah.
If you're going to do Mac OS on a non-Mac hardware, you're going to run into driver issues. Simple as that. There are ways to do it. All power to you, but stability is not fantastic. I think that covers off the tricked out laptop, unless there's any other questions. I will take that as a no. Desktop PC. So I think that's the leader of this one.
Yeah.
Am I?
Oh,
Yeah, I've done it most recently, I guess.
yeah, I think you've probably done this most recently. So
Yeah, cool. Okay. I haven't looked at. All right, I haven't looked at this slide deck, so I can only just waffle on. I've had a couple of bits of pizza and I'm feeling a bit sleepy. So what are we looking at here? Desktop PCs, pros and cons. All right, so okay, we'll just go through the list and I'll just talk nonsense. Someone feel free to interrupt if I'm not talking correctly. So the pros, target most budget. Yes, that just makes sense. If we're talking desktop PCs, you can go out and just purchase hardware from any hardware store right now for whatever your budget is and just have it. Server stuff's a little trickier to get. I know that there's been a lot of people talking in the chat about using eBay and Amazon for second-hand stuff, but realistically right now, if you have a budget of around 3,000 Australian dollars, which I think is about $2 US, you can build a really good PC that is going to last you. It's not going to future-proof you, as we've discussed, but it's going to at least provide you with a functional environment for at least 5 to 6 years, especially if you're buying bleeding-edge stuff right now. So that's going to target most budgets if you're doing bleeding edge stuff. I truly don't believe that $3,000 for a lab environment is a lot. I could be completely talking outside of my pay grade at this point, but I believe that if this is something that you absolutely need for your work environment, especially as I said in the chat, if you're based in Australia, you can claim all this stuff as a work expense. So I would tend to err on the side of spending more now. Because it's beneficial in the long run. But if you were even to go down the route of new generation but lower end hardware, you could potentially build a really reliable lab environment for under $2,000 using Gen 12 Intel CPUs. The one that I just built was a Gen 12 i5. I think that the CPU alone was just over $300. I specifically got that one because it had 8 cores, which, you know, as I think Steve was the one that said it, cores are the most important thing in this environment. But you could, there's reports that the Celeron, the Gen 12 Celeron variants are more powerful than i7s of you know, a couple of generations ago. So this stuff's getting crazy affordable. So, you know, there's just no route that this isn't a benefit. I've already really talked about the endless choice for components. You can essentially build this as if you're building a gaming PC. I think the joke here is that everyone builds their lab, but it ends up, you know, they stress test it with Call of Duty and Halo, right? So there is an endless choice of components. You just need to choose which brand you want to pick. Is it Team Red or Team Blue? Flexibility in size and appearance. You know, this goes down the conversation of how much space do you have. I know you guys have already spoken about this, but, you know, if you sit down and you decide that you want to build a desktop PC, but you don't have a lot of space, there is a lot of options for building in small form factor cases, especially if you start picking ITX motherboards, which are the smallest desktop motherboards that you can get. The downside to that is if you do decide to start going small form factor desktop PCs, is the price goes up considerably because everyone wants a small desktop PC. So the market knows that, and they've put the price up. So if you're willing to go a little larger in scale and you start picking things like ATX motherboards, you can get the same sort of quality for half the price. So the lab that I just built myself, I put in an ATX case, I got an ATX motherboard, and then the savings that I made on that, I put onto getting more memory and more storage. So that is just a conversation that you need to, or, you know, compromise that you need to make with yourself. Expansion options, this should go without saying. Again, this is the same conversation around if you choose ITX over ATX, you get less expansion options. For my lab, I specifically chose ATX because it provides me with 4 memory DIMMs by default, whereas an ITX really only gives you 2. So that gave me the option to have as much memory as possible. Similarly, PCIe expansion slots, you're going to get a lot more in ATX. So in the lab that I've just built, I've got 2 ATX ports and then 2 mini ATX PCIe ports, 2 full-size PCIe Gen 4 ports, and then 2 mini. And I'm using one of those minis for a network expansion card. So I've got significantly more expansion so that I can future-proof myself if I need to. Leveraging the latest technologies, I mean, all of this stuff should explain itself. You're building a normal computer. Most of these technologies migrate down to the consumer level well before you know, they end up in the server space, especially things like PCIe Gen 4 and all the really sort of fast transfer technology. You're going to be able to get it at an affordable price if you go down the route of desktop PCs now, as aside from deciding to build a high-spec server. And then easily account for mixed use case scenarios. I think this is, again, hopefully this all goes without saying. You know, the lab that I've just built myself, I'm using as a Microsoft has told me that the best way to do all server management is without a GUI. So I'm going to test that. But also at the same time, I wanted to upgrade my media server. So I'm currently doing both in a very overspec'd lab environment. That I'm just literally testing a theory that someone told me that the best thing to do is to do server core for everything. It's working. It's working fine at the moment. There was some hairy moments. The weekend was not fun, but it's all working very stably now, and everything is fantastic. So as far as mixed use case scenarios, if you're in a situation where you don't have a lot of storage space and you've maybe gone down the route of, well, a desktop PC takes up less space, then you can have it doing double duty. So you can have it running a Plex server if you want to have all the kid shows to entertain the kids while you test environments and that sort of thing. Cons, component choices can be overwhelming. Yes. If you've not built a PC in the last 5 or 6 years, the environment has changed significantly. It can be very overwhelming. I remember building PCs back when I was 16 or something, and everything was just Molex connectors and SATA plugs. And well, it wasn't even SATA plugs. The first time I saw that sort of stuff, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. So unless you're actively paying attention to the industry, it can get a little overwhelming. Luckily, there is lots and lots of content to help you get through that overwhelming nature on YouTube. And there's lots of great communities that can sort of really help you if this is the first time, or the first time in a very long time that you've built an environment. So it is overwhelming, but there is a lot of support. And then finally, mobility. Again, this should go without saying. Master Steve's amazing laptop that weighs 300 kilos and can only charge for stay off the power for a couple of minutes. He can travel with that as long as he's got access to a power plug. He's got a fully working lab. In the scenario that I have at home, I have multiple labs because I'm an idiot and I can't say no. But I need to make sure that at any given time, my home internet is online. And I have some kind of, I'm not going to say VPN because it's technically not a VPN, but I just need to make sure that my environment is connectable. If it's connectable, then I can do whatever I need, but then I'm also beholden to whatever internet connection that I'm using at whatever conference, at whatever hotel. And that is a risk that I'm willing to take because I can overpower my lab more than I can if I just had a laptop, if that makes sense.
Well, one thing that I did miss about my laptop that I didn't mention, I also can't plug it in on aeroplanes.
Yes.
Because there's a maximum wattage that's available per seat. And if you plug in a laptop like this or a MacBook Pro, you actually throw the circuit breaker.
Yeah, for sure. And you don't want to throw a circuit breaker on a plane. I've heard that bad things can happen.
Yeah.
So my goal with this sort of thing is that I should be able to travel with an ultra portable device, create a point-to-point SSH connection, be on the same network as my lab, remote into things, do anything that I need to do. But I'm also a big proponent of I should be able to do the work that I need to do and the examples that I need to do on any device so that I can not be that one developer that says, well, I don't know, it worked on my computer.
But you are a developer.
I am, but I'm actively trying to not be that person. So everything that I do in a scenario where I have a conversation with myself where I'm like, if tomorrow my lab were to fall over, how quickly could I provision this in Azure or some kind of cloud environment? Or does my laptop have enough spec that I can build a very basic lab? And then I'll spend the time to make sure that the provisioning of that lab is as automatable as possible, so that if it falls over, I can use something like Automated Lab or one of the roll your own solutions that Steve's got, or one of the things that we've all built ourselves from time to time, so that I can, at the drop of a hat, press a button and have my lab up and running. Maybe not as good as the lab that I've got at home, but if I need it, I can run it on a laptop that I can travel with.
Okay, so I just want to add one of the approaches I take to simplify that whole component choices can be overwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
I've always managed to find a feature that not many of the options have got, that I just convinced myself I needed that particular feature. So
Yeah.
it's a list of motherboards from 500 down to 1 or 2.
And is that by chance, say, selecting Threadripper?
No, there's that. Well, I already knew what CPU I wanted, but it was deciding which board. And it's like, so I had to get quite specific to narrow it down. I wanted a board that had dual 10 gig built in,
Mm-hmm.
and it had to be Intel. None of those other shoddy, dodgy
Sure.
providers. So that was fantastic. It got me down to a choice of 2 boards. Only one of them seemed to be available in market. So decision was made. Okay,
Yeah.
so no buyer's remorse or anything along those lines. And the
For
reason
sure.
why I had to settle on that feature was I still had extra 10 gig ports on my Switch. So, you know, so kind of everything just, it was kind of like, it was just meant to happen.
I'm surprised you didn't like turn around and go on SCP.
Oh,
Uplinks.
Oh no, that's
Yeah.
the other machines that have got that.
So
Yeah,
I kind of did the same thing, Mark, where so for the first lab, which is now my like physical workstation that I use as in my job, I to simplify the choice of hardware, I just went, okay, I'm going to build an ITX machine. Now that literally means, and I wanted the latest AMD CPU and all that sort of stuff. So picking a couple of things that you can put as your draw a line in the sand really does start limiting your options in a good way, because you know there is a lot that you can buy and a lot that's very overwhelming. So if you start sitting there going, I absolutely need the latest PCIe Gen 4. I know that we just talked about how it maybe isn't financially the best thing in the world, but if you start saying that I need a mini ITX and it needs to have PCIe Gen 4, then that's going to limit exactly what you can get in a good way, because you can start going, okay, well now I'm just going to drop it by price lowest to highest and pick the top one, you know, and then you can start building out from there. Because if you scope ATX motherboards and you've not done this in a while, you're going to be looking at just sheets and sheets of different options.
Now, the thing that used to be the good filtering option to get you in the right ballpark was TPM, yes, no.
Yeah.
If no, eliminate from conversation. But yeah, that's not, we can't sort of use that one as much anymore because it's,
Since 2017, yeah.
yeah. So now you could still say, you know, TPM 2.0, but even that is, you could go, okay, no, I don't want an on CPU TPM. If like I don't want a virtual TPM, I want like a proper physical TPM chip. So you can still do some of that, but if you can find like one or two things that just eliminate all the noise, and what you'll end up finding is that you're probably going to end up getting something from one or two motherboard manufacturers or whatever. Like, yeah, so just, even though it's overwhelming to begin with, start finding things that, you know, that will help you to eliminate that. Yeah. But the end result though of a lot of that is, a lot of the times a lot of the things that you'll sort of go, oh, but this has got this and this has got that. I guarantee you most of the time, 2 years later, it did not matter at all. Mm-hmm. If you think about all the things where you went, oh, I'll go for this option because it's got this, 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 and this. It's like, did you use any of those? Oh, yeah. No, I've got them just in case.
Yeah, I think the first lab that I built, and this was 8 years ago. The only reason that I ended up with the hardware that I got was that I set myself two limits. So the first one was that it needed to be, it needed to fit in a specific case that I'd bought to fit in the cupboard.
Yeah.
As I walked into my house, it needed to fit in this one specific spot. That necessitated a mini ITX motherboard. And then on top of that, I wanted to make sure I had as much hard drive space as possible. So I found a mini ITX motherboard that had 6 SATA ports, which is very difficult to find. So the solution was one of 2. So I just picked the cheapest one. And that lasted me up until last week.
Okay, so the storage story is actually really, really easy. Like, don't eliminate mechanical drives from the conversation if you need large amounts of storage. But if your goal isn't to hoard things, yeah, if your goal isn't to hoard things, and you don't need to go overboard on hard drives like you may have gone in the past. Now, the reality is, like as we're going from like mechanical drives to SATA SSDs up to NVMe drives, etc. Really, the big difference that you're going to see there is stepping away from mechanical hard drives. Like, that's where you get that, wow, this is a very, very different experience. And anyone who disagrees with that, let me know what mechanical drives you'd like to send me in return for any of your NVMe or SATA drives.
Yeah.
If it's, and I'll give you, 10 times the capacity that you had.
One good thing to throw in there that Dean's mentioned is, look, you can do tiering of storage, and it works really well. Like, this is where, especially if you're going to be running a server OS and go and put in storage spaces, then you can sit there and go, well, I've got my hot bucket, I've got my cold bucket, and it's all presented as a single disk.
Yeah. Completely.
Yeah. Just remember though, when you do start doing that, that you're committing to a server OS.
Yes.
So even though Windows Client does have storage spaces,
Don't use it.
it's not the same. Yeah. So things like the tiering and the dedupe capabilities you get in storage spaces on server are pretty cool technologies to use. But if you then try to recover those disks on a client, has anyone tried that? You get this weird sort of working thing. It's almost like you can read the data, but just don't try to write anything to it. So with drives, if you want the tiering, etc., if you don't want to have to worry about what's hot data versus what's cool data, etc., tiering in storage spaces, they couldn't make it any easier. So storage spaces in Windows Server.
Yeah.
Now we're not talking about storage spaces direct. We're just talking about storage spaces itself.
The other thing that I'll pull out is, and I don't think we've got it in here, is when you're looking to format your drive, there is REFS and NTFS. If you're going to be doing large file formats like VMs and things like that, REFS is actually faster and more efficient at handling those storage types.
And I think if you've got Windows Enterprise or Windows Workstation, I think that's also got REFS support in them. So
Correct.
for recovery purposes,
Correct.
it's not a bad thing.
What I will say though, I'm not going to say that I did this by experience, but if you're running inside of builds, just be wary that REFS is something that is being improved upon and worked on. So what you may end up with is, if you're on an insider build, you may need to get off insider to go back to a regular build. It might not work. And you may lose your whole lab. So if you're running your host, run production OS.
Yeah.
Don't do insider build, don't do any of that sort of stuff, because you can lose a lot of data very rapidly.
So I'm going to completely agree with what Steve said, but then also say that the machine that I'm talking about, that's got a ton of memory, etc., etc., it does have Windows 11 insider builds on it.
Yes.
And in the past, I've never really worried about delaying insider updates, because it's like, oh yeah, it'll update, it'll take a few minutes. Now it's like, oh no, I am delaying that until Saturday morning, because it's going to take, it doesn't take long for the Windows update part. It's the restart of that workstation board that takes forever. So I'm like, part of me knows it's the right thing to do. I probably should take it out of insiders at the next chance, so that I'm getting, or part of me is still thinking, I'm still going to get monthly updates, but that's better than getting weekly restart required at a minimum updates.
Yes.
So not too much there on the storage. Other things I just sort of say in general is, do you really need to go down the path of like any kind of striping, whether it's RAID or something else? My recommendation to you is, do not do it, regardless of how reliable you believe it to be.
Unless you have a hardware controller and it's dedicated,
and you've got hotspot
RAID
drives,
controllers and hotspots and all that.
And more importantly, you are actively monitoring it.
Yes.
And that's the problem here, is that you're, like, I had a hard drive die for the first time in a long time. I heard a beeping coming out back for a while. I'm like, I wonder what's going. Beep. And then it started going beep, 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 beep. And then it's like, oh. Yeah,
Mark, was this spinning Rust? Doing
yes.
the beep? Yeah,
Yes.
I've
Yeah.
literally, so I just said in the comments, I explained what the hardware spec for storage that I've got in my machine. So I migrated 2 spinning Rust drives from the old server and put them in the new one. I'm hearing the beep.
Yes.
It's it's only a matter of time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I ignored it, and like there was nothing. It was basically like copies of stuff that was all elsewhere. So it wasn't. So that's why I wasn't too fussed. But it's one of those things where if you're not willing to actually manage the infrastructure properly, it's better to lose one drive with data on it than losing OneDrive and losing the data from other things, etc. on there. Because if OneDrive's failed, the chances are multiple disks are probably from the same build, from the same batch.
Yeah.
So something that hits one is more than likely going to hit the drive sitting next to it that's 2 numbers up in the serial number game.
Yes. Okay. The other thing that I'll call out there is checkpoints. While it's not directly associated to storage, checkpoints are fantastic, except they don't get included in the size of the VM, and you can blow out your storage very, 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 very rapidly. So keep an eye on your checkpoints, and don't do checkpoints on your C drive.
Yeah.
Because you will run out of space, and your system will crash. And
Yeah.
start it up, and you will be in tears.
This goes to the same conversation as if you're going to set up a RAID arrays in your lab, you need to pay attention to this sort of stuff. Don't just set it up and never forget about it again, because then you'll start getting warnings very quickly that you're out of storage.
Yep.
Okay, so up next, networking. So one network adapter or many network adapters? More is better if you need more. So for me, basically this is my configuration, but it's for particular reasons. So, and a big part of it is making sure I've got, basically like connectivity through to like 5G backup, even though my router will fail over to that, I can fail over faster than my router fails over. So if I start seeing Teams start to get a little bit quirky, it's like I'll do a quick switch and barely noticeable. But the other ones, most of the other ones, so you can sort of see 210 gig at the top. They're basically, they're just sort of used, like I'm not using them for any virtualization pieces. But for the others, it's just, so I've still got a handful of these i350 4-port gigabit adapters. And really it's just to go through and do a bit of segmentation, not necessarily going into different networks, but basically you can see that I've basically just jumped into Device Manager and set them at different speeds, so that let's say if I'm home alone and I can cause whatever chaos I want with internet connectivity, I can just say, okay, the gateway VM is now on gigabit, end of conversation. Whereas if it's like I've got a bunch of other stuff happening, there's other people around, it's like, I probably can't do that. I might just sort of drop it down to 10 to a 10 meg connection instead. So could I go through and do that programmatically and not have extra network cables and ports? Yeah, but I've already had the hardware. I've got, still got a handful of these things that aren't sitting in anything right now. So basically for me, this is a way that I can sort of just start shaping traffic a little bit based on what what requirements I actually have. And then also, what's the Wi-Fi for? It was on the motherboard. That's why it's there. Not really something that I think I've ever used. I guess the Bluetooth is part of the same chip.
Correct.
So that would be the main logic behind that.
So one thing I'll throw in there, Mark, is broadband's fantastic. Having LTE on the mobile, fantastic. Like on the laptop, fantastic. Except you can't actually present an LTE device as a network adapter to Hyper-V. So when you're out traveling and things like that, you can't connect your LTE to your lab to do demonstrations. That's one of the downsides that I've found so far. Even though I have a ridiculous data plan on there, I can't connect my VMs and do what I need to do. Even though I've set unmetered, so that's probably the only pitfall that I've found with that LTE 5G scenario. But otherwise, yeah, like this laptop, I've got wired, wireless, and then when I'm at home, I've also got docking station. And I have networks out my Zoom. But yeah, it's just I want to call out that mobile broadband, fantastic, except you can't host it into your Hyper-V environment.
So yeah, so with the networking, even though we're sort of talking about keeping things simpler, for me, this is what I had to do to actually make it workable. So basically, it's not a dedicated lab. It's a lab in a house where there's an expectation that somebody could be watching a streaming service and not see the buffering icon constantly, for example. Or the good old, how many of you have been victims in your household of someone saying, are you downloading something?
Maybe.
Yeah. No, not
What are you seeing happening? Oh, my internet's slow. How about now?
Yeah, it's fixed. Yeah. Okay, so I mentioned that we wouldn't really talk too much about GPUs here because a lot of the GPU requirements for most people here is going to be the additional uses they put their lab equipment through, aka
Stress testing.
Yeah, stress testing.
Yes.
Yeah, so basically, how much heat can I generate in the case without, without the CPU starting to throttle? And a good high-end GPU does a fantastic job of that.
Oh, yeah.
I'm just a humble heat farmer.
Yes. So what if you do want to go down this path and you want to use it as a learning experience? Start playing around with GPU partitioning, where you can start, basically slicing up your GPU resources and saying, I want X% to go to VM1, X% to go to VM2, and then there are certain, certain bits of client software you can get them to connect into that endpoint. So you want to turn into a bunch of remote gaming machines where you're doing thin client remote gaming at really, really high performance by using the GPU. So this is something that, so Hyper-V provides this capability, at least to do the partitioning, but you'll need like some third-party client software to actually consume that without having to go, like you consuming it via the RDP clients, not going to give you the best experience for that. But there are ways, if you had to justify it technically as to why you need a 3090 Ti. It's like,
That's it.
CAD CAM usage.
Yes.
We've got a customer with CAD CAM, don't we? If not, why not?
We do now.
So one of the things I will say on that is that we've had this conversation a little bit around PCIe Gen 4 not being super important. If for whatever reason you wanted your lab to bifurcate your PCI lanes to split the GPU out to multiple virtual machines, having PCIe Gen 4 is a fantastic scenario for that, because the bandwidth in PCIe Gen 4 is barely touched with current gen GPUs. So being able to split that down the middle essentially means that you can have two or more devices that barely hit the sides. So it's a really good experience.
Okay, so we're finally moving on to software. Okay, now I guess the thing here is we've already sort of started to cover off some of this as we've been through some of the different hardware scenarios. But first of all, is it going to be client or server OS? Now, if we use my example, I'm using Windows 11 Insider. The Windows 11 piece, not the issue. Insider, not. But the reality is, I know that if I want consistent experiences on the different machines I'm using, and if I don't have Insider on a physical machine, I'm not going to sit there in a VM and play around with Insider, because that VMs are for other purposes. So pick and choose, is it going to be a server or a client OS? And there's no right or wrong answer here, it's just what makes more sense for you. Whereas for Ben's example, where he's talking about running server core just to see what you can and can't do when you're basically working headless, for example, like that's a perfect example of like a really good reason to go down that path. Where if you are fully committed to burning all GUIs to the ground, which I think is Ben's mission statement.
Yes. I haven't even started that website yet, but yes, that is my mission statement.
So basically just pick and choose once again, no right or wrong except for that particular scenario. And in a lot of cases, you might change your mind halfway through. You might get Ben might get partway down his server core journey and then go, oh, there's a bunch of other things that I want to do that's now restricted.
Sorry, please focus.
Does he have a name?
Yeah, it's my sister, I think.
Little Ben?
Yeah, little Ben.
The other thing I want to call out on this one though, Mark, is also the version of OS that you're running. So if you're like, well, I'm going to run a client computer, or let's use my scenario where I've got a laptop. And if I go and put Server 2016 on my laptop, Even on my old laptop, which is supported for it, has the drivers and all of that, it didn't actually have Bluetooth support.
Yeah, right. The drivers didn't
2019
support.
Well, no. So the OS itself didn't have the Bluetooth stack. But from Server 2019 onwards, it now has the Bluetooth stack.
Interesting.
It supports Wi-Fi a lot better. So the server OS is becoming more aligned with what you can do on the client OS with the additional server components.
Yeah, they tried to, I think when they were going down the nano server path,
Yeah.
the original goal with nano server, where it was supposed to be something that you were running on bare metal as opposed to something you were running in containers. They had to sort of make a lot of decisions around what a server OS should or shouldn't do. And so it's like Bluetooth, you sort of think about anyone who's using server on their laptop is an edge case scenario.
Yes.
And, you know, so as much as you'd see angry people in forums, you'd like, I bet you don't even.
You're like, yeah, why do you have Bluetooth on a server, you idiot? Yeah, what are you doing?
Because around Microsoft DRM, blah, blah. There's always something like that. And they spell Microsoft with a $sign.
Yes.
You know, it's always, you know, all of those things go hand in hand in that. I've got an image in my head of what that person looks like.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. And is it me? Because I still spell Microsoft with a $sign.
You don't have any facial, or you don't have enough facial hair.
Working on it. I'm working on it.
Work on it. I can give you lessons. This is like,
Thank you. Excellent. One of the other interesting things that maybe I'm the only person in the world that's interested by this, but Windows Server 2022, you can install Windows Terminal on it, which, as someone who has to spend 95% of their day in a server environment, because the product that I develop has to be in a server environment, having 2022 on there means that I get all of the creature comforts of Windows 10, Windows 11 in a server instance. So
is that in server core or GUI?
That is in GUI. My daily dev environment is with the desktop experience. Everything else, I have decided that I want to, as long as I can, or until I can't, follow the mantra that I should not have a GUI.
Well, and because the product that you're working on
has a GUI,
the components that like relies upon being patched by PC, yes, they are a sponsor. It actually config manager you can't install without a GUI, and WSUS you can't install without a GUI.
Yes, that's correct. But what's interesting with the with the GUI stuff is that it's still got a GUI.
Yeah.
It's just missing some features. So I don't know whether I can actually. I might be able to do this. I'm just going to jump onto my new lab so I can show something off, and I will share my screen.
Then we have to reshare, and it's going to be a whole thing here.
Oh, okay. Then I'll do a screenshot. Fine. All right.
Take a screenshot and paste it.
Put it in the chat.
All right. Sounds good.
So remember earlier I said there'll be elements of this that are going to be completely biased and one-sided. Use Hyper-V, deal with it. End of conversation.
Because it's
no questions. Okay, no. So for me anyway, that's the way it is. Last time I used VMware was probably VM Workstation, probably mid to late 90s kind of time frame. It was a long time ago. And basically, what's the reasoning for me for using Hyper-V? Some of the stuff you learn about Hyper-V translates to Azure. It's built into the OS. It's a checkbox. I turn it on, I turn it off. It gets updated at the same frequency as the OS. And as much as people go, but if you're using this or that, you might get this or that feature. I don't give about that feature because it's not built in here. I'll get excited if it gets added to Hyper-V in the future. But right now, the fact that you can do USB pass-through does not get me excited at all. So using what's built in, it's flexible, but also a big reason to use it, to use Hyper-V is any of the things like some of the pre-built hydration environments, etc., that Microsoft has, they are building Hyper-V VMs with the HDX files. So if you're going, oh, but what if I don't have Hyper-V? I told you the requirement was Hyper-V. You are telling me you have not met the requirement. I do not understand what your question or your concern is. Could you please rephrase that in a way where you start with, I'm sorry, I did not meet the requirements you set out for me.
What I'm going to do is do a nested virtual machine on my VMware platform so I can run my Hyper-V VM.
Well, that's what you could do. So with this, you've got plenty of options with Hyper-V. Probably the one that I think we probably should, even though I don't think anyone on here probably ever used it, you probably looked at it, but I think server 22, there's no more Hyper-V server. I think it was.
Yeah, Hyper-V server is pinned to 2019. They're no longer providing it as a standalone build. But the important thing to point out is that if you install any operating system and install Hyper-V, as in the module, it literally virtualizes the operating system and replaces it so that Hyper-V becomes the bare metal infrastructure or the bare metal hypervisor, and the operating system becomes a virtual container on that environment.
Yeah, and I think like some great intentions with Hyper-V server, but I think it just ended up causing a bunch of confusion about the licensing side, because people thought it was, oh, how do you license Hyper-V? Well, you don't license Hyper-V, you license the VMs you run on top of Hyper-V if those VMs require licensing, that is Windows VMs. So yeah, so with this, like the client, so even though on client side Hyper-V, there's a few things that are missing. Like I wish that on client side Hyper-V, we could do live migrations from one client to another or from a client to a server, but I completely understand why they do not have that functionality there. They're going, live migrations, get us here, do it on servers, don't do it here. But there's enough.
Workstations are not highly resilient devices, so therefore they should need to have live migration.
So even there, if you want to start playing around with some of that stuff, like where you're going, oh, but I want to do this stuff on server Hyper-V or whatever, start playing around with nested virtualization.
Yep.
Yes, you're going to see a perf hit, especially on storage. CPU, depends on your CPU. You may see almost nothing, or you may see a lot, depending on the instructions that are supported. But storage, you'll probably see maybe a 20 to 30% hit for each level, for each layer of nesting that you do.
So yes, you can nest a long way down.
Yeah, and be completely dissatisfied long before you got there.
Unless you have a ridiculous host.
So with these features, like this is an area where pretty much server has followed client in terms of CPU requirements. So there were CPU requirements that Windows required if you wanted to run client side Hyper-V. So things like your the slash, your second layer address translation. What was the AMD version? At that point in time, it was back when Intel was really the only CPU player, when AMD faded away for a while.
There's also VBS. One of the things I will call out, and I know we lost over on, but VirtualBox. How many people have used VirtualBox?
Hand up.
Have you tried running a 64-bit version of a client OS on VirtualBox with all the security components in the CPU enabled?
Not in a hot minute. Why? What goes wrong?
You actually have to turn off the virtualization, virtualized-based security components on
right.
to be able to run a 64-bit version of Windows on VirtualBox.
Right.
And especially like other good reasons, like looking at things like client Hyper-V as well, instead of like a VMware option there, is more than likely, if you're doing things properly on your desktops or workstations or laptops, you've probably already got elements of Hyper-V enabled for some of the containerized security features anyway. So if you're already using a little bit of Hyper-V, use a lot of Hyper-V. Why does Ben like Hyper-V? Because it's got PowerShell support. Is that a good throw out to you?
Pretty much. So prior to this environment, I was running ESXi because it was super reliable and free, and that was the exact price that I wanted to spend. It's all Linux. PowerShell works on Linux. Who cares? It's an amazing programming language. But functionally, yes, Hyper-V it just fits purpose now, and it's what I'm. The Kool-Aid is delicious. What can I say?
Exactly. Look, while we're sitting here and saying Hyper-V is what we recommend, it comes down to your use cases. So there are going to be certain operating systems, certain scenarios where you may need to run VirtualBox or you may need to run VMware because the vendor has only released a virtual appliance in that platform. Cool, makes sense. Whether you do that as your host OS or whether you do that as a nested, completely your choice. But this comes down to, for us, we find that Hyper-V does everything that we need it to do. And when it doesn't, we break it out. And let's face it, spin up another computer and do whatever we need to do over there.
Also, it is worth pointing out, because I literally just ran into this, that System Center Virtual Machine Manager has a lot of functionality to convert virtual machine files from one thing to another in a pretty resilient and very easy to use way. So if you do find yourself in a situation being given virtual machine files that do not work in the environment that you want, there is always a way to get around that.
And just to sort of finish up on this one before we move to the next slide, we don't have too many to go. This is also something that falls into the category of like, what's your intention with building the lab out? If you've already got some Hyper-V skills and it means you can build the lab out quickly and not have to learn about virtualization during the process, Hyper-V is the right option. If you know like your ESXs, your vSpheres, etc., if that's where your skill set is, then like, and you go, look, I just want to start with that. It's the easiest option for me. In that case, it's the best option for you.
Yeah.
Like unless you've got a burning desire to slow down what you can actually do in your labs while you're learning, while you're basically arguing with Hyper-V because it calls things that you're used to different names, and you're struggling to do exactly the same thing, but it does things differently.
The other thing to say is PowerShell remote, or PowerShell direct, I should say. So when you're using Hyper-V, you can actually create a PowerShell direct session from the host OS to interact